The asylum's history was shrouded in shadows. Built in the 1930s, it had once been a place of hope, a sanctuary for the mentally ill. But hope had quickly turned into horror. Rumors of abuse, unethical experiments, and mysterious deaths circulated through the small town, casting a dark pall over the institution. Patients were subjected to terrifying treatments: ice baths, electroshock therapy, and isolation in pitch-black rooms. The doctors believed in extreme measures, claiming they could shock the illness out of their patients. But what they left behind were broken souls, trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. In the 1970s, following a series of mysterious deaths, the asylum was abruptly closed. The records were sealed, and the patients who died within its walls were forgotten, their bodies left unclaimed. The building was abandoned to rot, its corridors echoing with the suffering of the past. Now, it stood like a tombstone on the edge of town, overgrown with ivy and surrounded by stories of ghosts. The locals swore they could hear screams on quiet nights, and strange lights were often seen flickering through the broken windows. They warned against approaching it, saying the asylum was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who suffered within its walls. The journalist, however, was not one to be deterred by ghost stories. Driven by a need to uncover the truth, they gathered their equipment and set out to explore the asylum, unaware of the horrors awaiting them inside. Little did they know, the asylum held onto its secrets with a grip of iron, and those who dared to pry often found themselves trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The journey to the asylum was filled with an eerie tension. The fog hung low over the road, casting everything in a ghostly light. Tall, gnarled trees lined the path, their branches stretching out like skeletal fingers, ready to snatch up anyone who ventured too close. The sound of crunching gravel under the journalist's boots was the only noise that pierced the oppressive silence. As they approached the asylum, its silhouette began to take shape through the mist, a monstrous, crumbling structure that loomed ominously in the distance. Its windows, shattered and hollow, stared out like the eyes of a giant, lifeless skull. Vines crept up the walls, twisting and coiling like snakes, hiding the scars of decades of decay. An old, rusted iron gate blocked the entrance, its chains hanging loosely as if it had been broken long ago by some desperate escape. A faded, "No trespassing" sign dangled from the gate, its letters barely legible under a thick layer of rust. The journalist hesitated, feeling a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the weather. A heavy sense of foreboding settled over them, pressing down on their chest like an unseen hand. For a moment, they considered turning back, heeding the warnings that echoed in their mind. But curiosity was a powerful force, and they had come too far to be swayed by a feeling. With a deep breath, they pushed the gate open, the creaking metal echoing through the fog like a sinister warning. The path ahead was littered with debris, broken glass, twisted metal, and overgrown roots that snaked across the ground. As they walked, the silence around them deepened, becoming almost tangible, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of unspeakable horrors. The asylum loomed ever larger, a dark monument to suffering and madness. And as they reached the front steps, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched from within the shadows of the building. The journalist pushed open the asylum's heavy, wooden door, which groaned on its hinges as if resisting their entry. Inside, darkness enveloped them like a shroud. The air was stale, carrying the acrid scent of mold and decay. They flicked on their flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick gloom and revealing the entrance hall. The scene before them was one of utter ruin. Broken furniture strewn about, shattered glass glistening on the floor, and yellowed papers scattered like autumn leaves. The wallpaper, once probably a soothing color, now hung in tattered strips, exposing the crumbling plaster beneath. The walls seemed to close in as they ventured deeper. The light from the flashlight cast flickering shadows, creating shapes that danced along the edges of their vision, vanishing as quickly as they appeared. A shiver ran down their spine as they noticed the faint outlines of handprints smeared across the walls, as though countless people had once tried to claw their way out. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant drip of water echoing from somewhere deeper in the building. Every step they took seemed to stir up memories buried within the asylum's walls. A soft creaking sound came from above, causing them to look up at the sagging ceiling. Dust and fragments of plaster floated down, illuminated by the flashlight's beam like snowflakes in a winter storm. The journalist's heart pounded in their chest, a rhythmic reminder of their own vulnerability. They moved further into the asylum, the floorboards creaking underfoot, as if protesting their intrusion. Then, the first whisper came, a faint, almost imperceptible murmur. It was followed by a soft rustling sound, like the shuffle of feet across the floor. The journalists stopped, holding their breath, their eyes scanning the darkness for movement. But there was nothing, only the empty corridor stretching out before them. They forced themselves to keep going, convincing themselves that it was just the wind. But deep down, they knew that the asylum was waking up, its ghosts stirring from their long slumber to greet the new visitor. The hallway stretched out before the journalist like an endless tunnel, its walls lined with rusted doors that led to the unknown. Each door was sealed tight, marked with faded patient numbers. The light from the flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move and shift just beyond the edge of sight. As they walked, the sound of their footsteps echoed loudly, the noise bouncing off the cracked walls and disappearing into the dark void ahead. The air grew colder, thickening with a strange, electric tension. Then, the whispers began anew, this time clearer and more insistent. Soft, mournful voices filled the air, mingling with faint cries and distant murmurs. It was as though the walls themselves were alive, replaying the agony of those who had once been confined within. The journalist paused, their heart racing. The flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, they saw a figure standing at the far end of the corridor. A silhouette, dark and hunched, staring back at them. But as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving only the cold emptiness in its wake. They approached one of the doors, reaching out with a trembling hand to touch its rusted handle. It was ice cold, sending a jolt of fear through their body. They hesitated, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, as if opening the door would unleash something that should never be set free. But curiosity got the better of them. With a creak, the door swung open, revealing a small, dimly lit room filled with overturned beds and torn bedding. The smell of mildew and decay was overpowering. As they stepped inside, the whispers grew louder, turning into indistinct words and sobs. The walls seemed to pulse, the paint peeling away in strips as if reacting to their presence. The journalist turned, their flashlight sweeping across the room, and saw the unmistakable shape of handprints smeared across the window pane. A sign that someone, or something, had tried to escape this place. A chill ran down their spine. The asylum was more than just abandoned. It was alive, feeding off the fear of anyone who dared to walk its haunted halls. The ward was a scene from a nightmare, a room frozen in time. Metal-framed beds stood in disarray, their once white sheets now tattered and stained with grime. The air was heavy with the smell of decay, mingled with the faint, bitter scent of chemicals long evaporated. The walls were lined with grimy tiles, cracked and streaked with dark stains. The windows were boarded up, casting the room in a perpetual twilight that distorted every shadow and shape. The journalist moved cautiously, their flashlight illuminating the floor cluttered with personal items, children's toys, crumpled photographs, and even a diary with its pages yellowed and curled. Each item told a fragment of a story, a life that had been confined to this place of suffering. They picked up the diary, flipping through the fragile pages filled with scrawled handwriting. Words of despair, pleas for freedom, and cryptic ramblings covered the pages, painting a picture of the torment that had been endured here. Suddenly, a scraping sound echoed through the room. The journalist froze, their flashlight darting to the source. One of the beds had moved, sliding a few inches across the floor on its own, leaving behind fresh drag marks on the grimy tiles. Cold fear surged through them, rooting them to the spot. The air grew colder, and the whispers returned, now louder and filled with anguish. It was as if the spirits of the patients were reaching out, trying to make their pain known. The journalist felt a presence behind them, a sensation of eyes boring into their back. Slowly, they turned, heart pounding, and caught a faint glimpse of movement in the darkness. For a heartbeat, they saw it. A distorted figure standing in the far corner, its features obscured by shadows. It was tall, hunched over, with arms that seemed unnaturally long, hanging by its sides. The whispering grew frantic, echoing off the walls in a cacophony of voices. The figure took a step forward, its foot dragging across the floor, and the journalist felt a surge of terror that threatened to swallow them whole. They backed away, clutching the diary in their hand, as the room seemed to close in around them. The ward was no longer just a room. It was a prison, and its restless spirits had awakened. The journalist ventured deeper into the asylum, finding a set of double doors that seemed out of place amidst the crumbling surroundings. Unlike the others, these doors were made of thick metal, rusted and corroded, yet still imposing. A faded sign above read, "Experimental Wing." They hesitated, a sense of foreboding settling in the pit of their stomach. But driven by curiosity and a need to uncover the truth, they pushed the doors open. Inside, the air was frigid, and the smell of antiseptic lingered, as if the room was trying to mask the horrors that had occurred there. In the center of the room stood an old, leather-bound chair, its surface cracked and stained with dark splotches. Leather straps hung loosely from the armrests, eerily suggesting that someone, or something, had been restrained here. The walls were lined with shelves containing crude, rusted medical tools. Scalpels, syringes, forceps, each more grotesque than the last. A large, cracked mirror hung on one wall, its surface covered in smudges and fingerprints, as if many hands had touched it in a desperate attempt to escape. The journalist approached the chair, their eyes scanning the room, taking in every unsettling detail. The atmosphere here was different, denser, darker. They could almost hear the echoes of past screams, the cries of those who had been subjected to unspeakable treatments. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed the pain and terror, replaying it over and over like a twisted record. As they reached out to touch the chair, a sudden chill swept through the room, and the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening crash. Their heart raced as they turned to face the door. The room grew colder, and the shadows along the walls began to shift, stretching and twisting into unnatural shapes. The journalist's flashlight flickered, casting an eerie glow that made the shadows seem alive. A faint whisper echoed through the room, followed by a soft, shuffling sound. They turned towards the mirror, and their blood ran cold. Reflected in the cracked glass was not their own face, but that of a ghostly figure, a patient with hollow eyes and a twisted expression of agony. The figure's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Instead, the room filled with the cacophony of whispers, as if the spirits of the patients were crying out in unison. Panicked, the journalist stumbled back, bumping into a tray of instruments. The metal tools clattered to the floor, but they barely registered the noise. Their gaze remained fixed on the mirror, where the ghostly figure pressed its hand against the glass, smearing it with a dark, inky substance that resembled blood. It mouthed a single word, "Run." Before they could react, the room went dark, the flashlight finally dying. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, echoing from every corner of the room. Cold hands seemed to brush against the journalist's skin, and a wave of nausea washed over them. They fumbled for the door, their fingers slipping on the icy metal handle. Finally, they managed to pull it open, stumbling out into the corridor, leaving the experimental room and its tormented spirits behind. But as they fled, they could still hear the whispers following them, a grim reminder of the horrors that had once taken place in that room. The hallway twisted and turned as the journalist fled, their heartbeat pounding in their ears. It was as if the asylum itself was alive, shifting its layout to confuse and disorient them. They stumbled through the darkness, gasping for breath, their skin prickling with the sensation of being watched. Suddenly, they skidded to a halt in front of a large, iron door marked with the word "Quarantine." A moment of hesitation gripped them, but the sound of soft footsteps behind them drove them to push the door open and step inside. The room was pitch black, the air heavy with an unnatural coldness. The journalist's breath misted in the frigid air as they swept the flashlight around. The beam caught glimpses of strange shapes, Gurneys lined up against the walls, shadowy figures hunched in corners, and something glistening on the floor. They moved cautiously, each step echoing in the oppressive silence. Then, out of the corner of their eye, they saw it, a figure emerging from the darkness. It moved slowly, almost languidly, its form flickering in and out of focus like a shadow in the fog. The journalist froze, their mouth dry with fear. The figure was translucent, a ghostly apparition of a patient, dressed in tattered hospital garb. Its face was contorted in an expression of pain, eyes hollow and mouth twisted into a silent scream. It advanced towards them, arms outstretched, whispering words that were garbled and impossible to understand. The journalist stumbled back, tripping over a gurney and falling to the floor. The flashlight rolled away, casting wild, erratic beams across the room as the entity loomed over them. It bent down, its face inches from theirs, the air around it freezing and filled with the scent of decay. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, filling their ears until they thought they might go mad. Then, just as it reached out to touch them, the flashlight beam flickered over its eyes, and it recoiled with a hissing wail. Scrambling to their feet, the journalists snatched up the flashlight and backed away, their eyes locked on the apparition. The entity hovered for a moment, its form wavering, before dissolving into the shadows. The room fell silent once more, but the terror lingered, pressing down on the journalist's chest like a heavy weight. They turned and fled, the whispers now a distant murmur in the corridors behind them, panting. The journalist tore down the asylum's corridors, the walls seeming to close in around them. Every hallway they turned into stretched out endlessly, twisting and warping before their eyes. It was as if the asylum itself was bending reality, turning its interior into a maze designed to trap them. Doors that had been open minutes before were now sealed shut, and new passages appeared where none had existed. The building was alive, feeding off their fear and disorientation. The flashlight flickered, its beam growing weaker with every step. Shadows danced along the walls, shifting and merging into grotesque shapes that writhed in the darkness. The whispers began to rise again, not as soft murmurs this time, but as frenzied cries and laughter, echoing through the corridors in a cacophony of madness. The journalists pressed their hands to their ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was useless. The asylum was inside their mind now, twisting their thoughts, making it impossible to distinguish between reality and nightmare. They stumbled into a room, slamming the door behind them. It was a small, windowless cell, its walls covered in claw marks and smeared with something dark and dried. The ceiling seemed to press down, the air thick and suffocating. The journalist felt the room spinning, the walls warping and closing in as if trying to crush them. They gasped for air, the flashlight beam wobbling as their hands trembled. Suddenly, they felt a presence in the room, a coldness that crept up their spine and froze them in place. Slowly, they turned, the beam of the flashlight revealing a figure standing in the corner. It was a patient, their body contorted and twisted, eyes wide and staring directly at the journalist. The figure's mouth opened and a scream erupted, not from the apparition, but from within the journalist's own mind. It was a scream of pure terror, filling their head with a noise so intense that they dropped to their knees, clutching their ears. The figure moved towards them, its limbs jerking unnaturally, the shadows around it writhing like snakes. In that moment, the journalist realized the truth. The asylum was trying to consume them, to turn them into another lost soul trapped within its walls. A surge of panic shot through them, breaking the spell of fear that had frozen them. With a final, desperate effort, they scrambled to their feet and ran, crashing through the door and back into the twisting maze of corridors. The journalist ran, heart pounding and breath ragged, but the asylum seemed to stretch on forever. Every corner they turned led to another hallway, twisting and stretching out into darkness. The air was thick, pressing against their skin like a cold, damp cloth, and the whispers followed them, growing louder with each step. Shadows lunged from the walls, reaching out with claw-like fingers, forcing them to dodge and weave as they stumbled through the maze of corridors. Desperation gnawed at them as they searched for an exit. The asylum was alive, its walls pulsing as if with a heartbeat, every creak and groan echoing in their mind. They burst into what they recognized as the entrance hall, the front doors looming ahead, but a heap of debris blocked their path. Broken furniture, rusted metal, and splintered wood formed an impassable barrier, sealing off the exit. Panic surged, threatening to overwhelm them as they frantically looked around for another way out. In the corner of the room, they spotted a shattered window partially covered in vines. It wasn't ideal, but it was their only chance. Summoning every ounce of strength, they sprinted toward it, the whispers now a cacophony of screams and laughter, urging them to give up. As they approached the window, the shadows in the room seemed to swell, rising up around them like a tidal wave of darkness. With a final, terrified glance over their shoulder, they saw the shadowy figures of the asylum's ghosts closing in. Their faces were distorted in anguish, hands reaching out with twisted fingers, desperate to pull the journalist back into the depths of the building. In a rush of adrenaline, the journalists threw themselves at the window, crashing through the glass. Shards sliced into their skin, but they didn't care. The cold night air hit them like a splash of water, waking them from the nightmare. They stumbled through the overgrown foliage outside, falling to their knees as they gasped for breath. Behind them, the asylum stood in eerie silence, its broken windows now dark and hollow. For a moment, the journalists thought they saw a flicker of movement in one of the upper windows, a pale figure watching them with empty eyes. A shiver ran down their spine, but they forced themselves to look away. They scrambled to their feet and ran, not stopping until they reached the safety of their car. Fumbling with the keys, they started the engine and sped away, leaving the asylum and its horrors behind. The road ahead was shrouded in fog, but they didn't care. All that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between them and that cursed place. As they drove, the whispers began to fade, replaced by the pounding of their own heartbeat. They dared a glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadows chasing after them, but there was nothing, only the silhouette of the asylum shrinking into the mist. The days that followed blurred into a fog of anxiety and unease. The journalist couldn't shake the feeling that something from the asylum had followed them back. Shadows seemed to linger at the edges of their vision, and every mirror or reflective surface made them flinch, expecting to see a ghostly figure staring back. They moved through their apartment like a stranger, unable to fully relax, always looking over their shoulder. Nighttime was the worst. In the darkness, the whispering returned, faint and distant, like echoes from another world. Sleep came only in fitful snatches, broken by vivid nightmares of the asylum's endless halls and the twisted faces of the ghosts. The memory of that place haunted them, a persistent reminder of the horrors they had witnessed and narrowly escaped. They tried to talk to others about what had happened, but words failed to capture the sheer terror they had felt. The asylum's grip on their mind was like a sickness, festering in the silence of their apartment. One day, they decided to visit a therapist, hoping to find some peace or explanation for the lingering fear. But as they sat in the waiting room, they caught sight of their reflection in a glass window. For a fleeting moment, they saw it, the pale figure with hollow eyes, standing behind them. The blood drained from their face, and they looked away, heart hammering in their chest. Rushing out of the building, they realized the truth. The asylum was not just a place. It was an entity, a force that had reached into their very soul. It had marked them, leaving an indelible scar that would never truly fade. The journalists knew they could never go back to that place, yet they were forever bound to it by the memories and the fear it had instilled. That night, as they sat alone in their apartment, the whispering began again. It was faint, barely audible, like a distant echo carried on the wind. But it was there, a reminder that some horrors can never be fully escaped. The journalists stared into the darkness, clutching a flashlight in their trembling hand. They were free for now, but deep down, they knew the asylum's grip would never truly release them. The asylum stood quietly on the edge of town, its windows dark and empty. It waited, patient and cunning, for the next soul curious enough to uncover its secrets. Inside, the shadows writhed, and the whispers carried on, weaving a tale of madness and despair. The journalist had escaped its grasp, but the asylum would always be a part of them, lurking in the corners of their mind, a chilling reminder of the horrors that lie just beyond the edge of reality. If this story sent chills down your spine, don't forget to subscribe for more terrifying tales like this one. What would you do if you found yourself inside an abandoned asylum? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. Thanks for listening, and remember, some places are better left forgotten